early. So wasn't even in the program, so appreciate for those of you who are here because it was on the app or because you saw our flyer. But the interest in this issue has been pretty paramount today. There's been a lot of people coming by the environmental booths in the hub talking about how this is a big issue for young people and for the conservative movement to try to retake these issues. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And really excited about the panelists we have. But first I want to introduce our organization. It's the American Conservation Coalition. It's a nonprofit focused on bringing conservatives back into environmental discussions on conservation, clean energy and energy issues, as well as other environmental issues that we face as a country. So really excited to kind of dive into it a little bit and how, as a movement, we can take this issue back. I'm Benji. I will be your moderator. I'm the president of the ACC and got started with these issues a few years ago, really trying to make this a more bipartisan issue and one that conservatives can have their own answer on. And so with that, I will introduce our panelists. To my left here is Danielle Butcher. She's the COO of the American Conservation Coalition, and she's a political consultant. She's also contributed to Fox News Radio, Vox, The Hill, among other publications, so we're really excited to have her. Next to her is Stephen Rowe. Stephen Rowe is the Leadership Institute's Deputy Director of Digital Training. He's a contributor for Campus Reform, a 30 Under 30 award winner, and he's also a board member of ACC Campus, which is our educational operation. And then we've got Cole Simons on the end. Cole is the Chief of Staff of ClearPath Foundation, an organization that advocates for conservative clean energy policies to spur the innovation and deployment of zero-emitting power sources. With his work at ClearPath, he brings a focus on bridging policy and messaging, which is something that we'll definitely talk about today. So excited to get into it, and welcome to our panelists. So the first question I have is kind of related about where we are today as a party. Trump's lowest approval rating is actually on the environment, and millennials feel like they're being left behind a little bit on this issue. But there was a time where the Republican brand was known as one that was pro-environment, and that stereotype has changed a lot over the past few years, not due to Trump alone or anything like that. And where do you think the Republican Party has the most room to improve on the environment? And what do you think the state of the GOP is on the environment in terms of its policy and perception? We'll start with you, Danny.
Sure. So I think that in terms of our policy, we're actually pretty solid. The problem is we don't talk about our policy. We don't talk about our wins. We don't talk about the environment, really, period, at all. And I think that when we come to the GOP, we always want to talk about our winning issues, which are the economy, taxes, things like that. And everybody always says, like, the GOP shouldn't talk about issues that are not winning issues. And it may be true that the environment isn't a winning issue for us, but it's definitely a losing issue for us, because that's where we're losing women in urban areas, and especially younger people, such as millennials and Generation Z. It's consistently shown that the environment is a top 3 issue for younger people, and the GOP doesn't talk about it at all. So I think that's definitely somewhere we can improve.
Yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's definitely an area we can improve, because you think about the history that you're relating to, Teddy Roosevelt and, Nixon. It tends to be Republican presidents that have done the most for the environment in the past, and somehow we've lost that along the transition. And I think it really comes down to taking back what I think is color, because I think that the left has really co-opted the color green, very much like, Planned Parenthood co-opted the color pink, right? So I think it'd be really, really good in our messaging, really, really good for the party to really start accepting green as a color that we stand by and that is popular. You see what happens on the left with, AOC's Green New Deal. You think about it, it has the word green in it, and now everyone's supporting it. They didn't even read the thing. It says green, so it's green light for them to go ahead and pass and vote for it. And so I think it really starts with taking back the culture of environmentalism, and fundamentally, for me, that comes down to the color.
Cool.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate, we do have a story to tell. We have been actually over the past 2 years very strong in environmental policies, at least on a clean energy side. If you look at it, the Department of Energy over the past 2 years have had its 2 largest budgets ever in clean energy R&D. We passed 45Q, which basically allows fossil fuel generating plants to capture their carbon. And we've streamlined the licensing processes for hydropower and advanced nuclear in a way that hasn't been done before, so it really allows for the deployment of those as those technologies come to market. So we have a story to tell. There is a compelling story, and that story is that we have enabled the market to pick up new technologies that are market competitive, and we are doing it in a way that doesn't harm our economy and instead bolsters our economy and has a whole ton of other benefits as well. What we need now on a policy side is to continue to make these clean energy technologies market competitive so we can continue to tell that story, grow that story, and actually make a move towards decarbonization as well as other environmental priorities.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I think that kind of leads into the next question, which is talking about the policy itself. And in all honesty, most people in general, especially conservatives, don't really know conservative policy on the environment at all. They don't really know what we stand for. And because of that, we've lost countless voters, and really the stereotype is that conservatives just don't care about the environment, that we actually hate the environment, that we want to actively degrade the environment, which we know isn't true. But why do you think this has happened? Well, how did we get to this place? And how do we make our message more attractive and kind of change that stereotype? And we'll start with you, Cole.
As I've said just a few seconds ago, we have a story to tell. What we need to do now is actually lean in and tell that story. What a lot of people don't realize is so far in Congress this year, we've had 3 hearings on either climate change or clean energy innovation in the 3 most important committees for this issue: House Energy and Commerce, House Science and Technology, and Senate Energy and Natural Resources. In those hearings, almost every single Republican in the room and on the dais said that we need to work to decarbonize, that climate change is an issue, and we need to take responsible, pragmatic steps to fixing that as an issue. Senator Barrasso from Wyoming posted an op-ed in the New York Times stating that same thing. Climate change is real, we need to decarbonize, and we have a responsibility to fix that issue. Ranking Leader Walden, as well as his subcommittee chairs Upton and Shimkus, posted an op-ed saying actually that Republican solutions to climate change are actually better than Democratic options to climate change, because we aren't looking to expand the government. We aren't looking to stifle our economy in order to make these changes. We're actually looking to unleash our economy to make these changes. So the story's there. We're starting to talk about it more. What we really need is to lean in and publicize that, hey, it's no longer a party of denialism or something like that. We see the issue, but now we're debating the solutions, and it's going to be a hell of a fight over the solutions, but it's a conversation about solutions. We just need to let people know that that's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like what you had to say there, and I agree in a lot of respects. I think it's really important that when you're first having these conversations with people that really don't care about policy very much, but know they care about the environment, know they care about, green trees and the beautiful national parks that exist in this wonderful country of ours, is that it really comes down to a persuasive argument that means you aren't just blasting, the next person you walk out there and say climate change at them, right? You're going to scare them. It's like the boogeyman, like, whoa, you got me. That was really frightening. Whoa, you kind of scared me. But instead, talking about environmentalism or caring about the environment, like just a real quick question. It's like, do you believe in climate change is a very strong question in comparison. Do you care about the environment? And I think you'll start getting more people caring about policy if you ask them those questions and start warming them up to the next level. It's like the pro-life argument, right? You can't go up to someone and say abortion, right? You gotta warm them up, start asking questions, and kind of see where people are at. Come to where they are, and then you can start talking about these solutions, the fantastic ones that you're mentioning, and it's going to be a much better conversation that is productive.
So I think just building off of what Stephen had to say about how you say climate change and people kind of freak out, they don't want to talk about it, that's also partly our fault, right? So the left has really taken on environmentalism as one of the issues that they can champion, and they've made it pretty divisive over the last decade or so, but instead of combating that, we've kind of walked away from it. We're kind of like, okay, you can have it, this is yours, we're not going to engage, and that's a huge mistake on our part, because now you see Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposing this crazy resolution, and it's the only resolution that addresses climate in a major way. So all the young people who care about the environment are like, yeah, this is great. it's, borderline socialism, but they think it's great because it's all they have, it's all they know. So as conservatives, we have to do a better job of giving alternatives and showing that there's more than one way to do it, and the way that is best and most effective is limited government, free market policies.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think one of the problems that we've had is, again, just not talking about it. And the reason why we've lost it is because we don't talk about it. So people just assume the worst when you're not talking about something. And so when one side's talking about it and has all these solutions, I mean, we talk about the Green New Deal, but the Democratic Party has had dozens and dozens and dozens of climate solutions over the past 10 or 15 years they've tried to propose. They do a lot in conservation and energy. And even though it's very much flawed most of the time, they're actually talking about it. It's part of their campaign platforms. It's part of their 2016, 2012 presidential platforms. And when we don't do that, that's when we lose people on it. It's not because of specific things that we're actually doing. It's a lack of discussion on our part. So I think it'd be good to talk about some not deep policies about what has worked, but what types of ideas and laws and policies that conservatives have embraced are things that we should be focusing on in our messaging. What types of ideas could appeal to conservatives and also work in the environmental policy space? Danny?
So in terms of ideas, I think the idea of innovation and the idea of competition are very conservative ideas. They're kind of the pillars of conservatism, if you will. And those are very much ideas that we can use to propel forward environmentalism. So one example would be, I think it's like 100 major companies have agreed that they're going to go 100% renewable energy, not because of a government mandate, but because that's what consumers in the marketplace are demanding that they want from big businesses. And so using that idea of this is what the consumers want, so this is what the businesses are doing, is a great example of how we can use the market and competition to have environmental reforms that are effective.
Yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, 100%. I love the economic argument. I'm a big numbers guy. I think that's really important. And when you're talking to conservatives, there's also another one that I think is really powerful, and it's actually a religious argument. And it's that, in a lot of what the Bible talks about is leaving the earth better for the next generation. And that same principle applies, and I think from a religious perspective, you can connect with a lot of people that want to have an earth that's better for their children, and we left it in a better position than when we found it. There's an old bathroom stall thing in airplanes that said, as a courtesy for the next customer, it would be a pleasure if you left it better than when you found it for the next person coming through. Well, that same principle applies 100%. And so there is that argument when you're talking to conservatives a lot. I think it is a really powerful one, because then it is calling upon something that's higher than ourselves. We appreciate what, if you are religious, what God has created for you and what you're able to experience and his blessings on this earth. And for someone who's Christian, and that tends to be a lot of conservatives, that's a really persuasive argument. So I would definitely lean into that a little bit, especially as you're talking to people, perhaps at CPAC or in a conservative meeting about leaving the environment and our earth in a better place.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo Danny a little bit. We at ClearPath like to say we don't want to make traditional energy more expensive. We want to make clean energy less expensive. We want to make it market competitive. Because the reality is, climate change and environmental issues are all a global problem, right? If we in the United States take a path policy-wise that only decarbonizes the United States or solves environmental issues in the United States, just looking at it from an emissions perspective, by 2050, the emissions growth in non-OECD Asian countries alone will be larger than if the United States went to zero emissions tomorrow. And it doesn't matter whether those emissions are here or in China, it affects everywhere the same way. So if we're talking about policy solutions, we hit on innovation. I think that's key. Innovation, regulatory reform, and some incentives to help bring first-of-a-kind technology to the market and let it build a few times, because as you build more, prices drop. We've seen that in solar, we've seen that in anything that's ever manufactured. So really the key is saying, hey, how can we find the right technologies that could really be breakthrough technologies, and how can we get them to a market competitive level? Because that doesn't only have a benefit to the United States domestically, but if we develop those technologies here, it also greatly opens up the ability to export those technologies and completely changes some of the geopolitical games that are happening right now.
Yeah, it's a really good point as well. And again, kind of building off of that, I think it's something where there's kind of a wall that's put up when we talk about these things with conservatives. I mean, you can even see it sometimes here at CPAC when you talk to somebody and you talk about the environment, and until they know that you're actually you're on their side, it takes a while, right? Like, you have to get past a barrier that is automatically there when you talk about the environment. So, and that's actually led a lot of people to think that they shouldn't care about the environment or shouldn't care about environmental policy. So one of the questions that I think is really important to ask is, why should conservatives care about the environment, and why should they care about environmental policy? And I'd love to hear your feedback on that. And I think a lot of it starts from where conservatives live, which is a lot of times in natural areas, whereas the liberal movement often lives in urban areas. But would love to hear what you guys think. Cole?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important thing to remember, because, if we make clean energy less expensive for those people, let's say you're a cattle rancher in Wyoming, you can install cheap wind turbines and have a second form of income. That's a huge deal as cattle prices drop and as that socioeconomic status of those previously very lucrative careers generally peters out a little bit. I think you can talk about it from a national security aspect. Most military bases abroad rely on the country they're in, their grid, and their energy system to get power. And you can imagine that that's not always very reliable, and sometimes you're dealing with hostile nation states when dealing with that. Small advanced nuclear that's safe and secure can be installed on bases, and you never have to worry about that again. Carbon capture, capturing the emissions from fossil fuel plants, whether it's natural gas or coal, there's a lot of people in those industries now who are very worried about their livelihood moving forward. And I think if you develop technologies like that, then you're providing a lot of these conservative voters, a lot of these people in these conservative spaces, path forward to not have to worry about whether their paycheck's going to come in a year or 5 years or 10 years. So there's a huge range of reasons to care about this, and I didn't even touch on health or medicine or any number of other things, and I could go on all day about it, but I don't think you guys want me to. So I'll leave it there, but I think you're right. It affects us where we live. It affects conservatives where they live, and it's an easy story to tell without even ever mentioning just the pure environmental aspects of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I like that you brought up the urban versus rural dichotomy, because I'm from the great state of Montana. Is anybody else from Montana? Hey, yeah, that's how that usually goes. I'm like the unicorn. I'm the one Montanan you're going to see for the next 7 years. So hopefully I'm a good representative of my state. We'll see how it goes. But I think it is weird, because when you look at that dichotomy, you see that, rural voters tend to be, very Republican, and, urban voters tend to be very Democrat. And it seems like we're caring about each other's places more than caring about the place that we exist in sometimes. It just feels like that if you listen to the news cycle. But I really want to focus on that innovation thing and come back to it for just a second, because I think when you are talking to these people and you're talking about innovation, you think about agriculture and how much tech and high tech is in, and AI is in agriculture and managing these farms. I don't think that tech is very, very far away from these farmers. We always have this picture of, someone in overalls that doesn't know a lot, that kind of works at his, tractor plow a little bit. But I promise you, these people are very up to date with technology. They've got internet. They don't ride horses to school. And so we can talk to them about this stuff, and, always asking them questions like, when has the government ever innovated something that you use today? Like, did the government create the iPhone? Like, did the government create, the famous meme on the internet, like the Greenpeace versus the thumbstick thing? The thumb drive has saved more trees than Greenpeace ever could, which was a government initiative. And so always bringing it back to that, that there's an incredible opportunity, an incredible market for these types of technologies, these types of products that can really shape the future. And us being at the forefront is one of the key things that we can do for our party.
I have one.
I apologize. I'll hold on to this one.
So I think conservatives should care about the environment, because I think everyone should. And I don't know anyone who actively hates the environment. I think that right now there's a narrative that conservatives don't care because they're not talking about it, or because we don't support the mainstream solutions. But I think we need to, dispel this notion that just because you don't support the mainstream ideas doesn't mean you don't support it in general. Just because you're not for the Green New Deal doesn't mean that you hate the environment. So as conservatives, it's our job to talk about it more, because we do have to change that narrative, and it is an uphill battle, but it's not one that we should walk away from.
Yeah, really good points. And actually, there's been a lot done on these issues over the past 2 years that really flies under the radar. And I didn't really start deeply following environmental policy until probably 3 years ago. But the mainstream media and the conservative media and the liberal media, they don't really focus on the solutions that have been going through Congress and a lot of times in states as well. I think, Cole, you probably have a pretty good read on things that have happened over the past couple of years and in Republican power in the House and the Senate. So if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about some of the successes that have happened through Congress that the president has signed and Republicans have either co-sponsored or introduced, and really allow us to dive into some of the work that's already been done, even though it comes across in the public eye that nothing's being done by Republicans on the environment.
Yeah, and I'll stick to the energy space because that's what I know best. And I referenced this a little bit a few minutes ago in my first answer. The DOE R&D budgets have reached their highest levels for the past 2 years. Republicans in the appropriations process have given more money to developing clean energy solutions than any other administration ever. That's big. People don't realize that. That's a surprise to most people. We've passed 2 standalone nuclear bills. We haven't done that since 2007. Some would argue 2005, but that's semantics. There's multiple other bills in the process. Use It is one that focuses on building CO2 pipelines. There's a number of other regulatory fixes that are currently going or in process. And I think it's important also to not, as Danny mentioned earlier, talking about utilities and corporate decisions around this issue. Excel in Colorado, one of the largest utilities in the United States, committed to going to 80% clean by 2035 this past year and wants to go to 100% clean by 2050. They did put a marker on it, however, and said, look, we can't do this solely on renewables. We need carbon capture technologies, so we're going to need fossil fuels that don't emit. We're going to need advanced nuclear. We're going to need these things to actually get to this point. The people who are putting it into the ground, the people who are running our energy systems are saying, look, we can do this if we have the technologies, if it's market competitive. To go one step back to policy real quick, I'll just jump down to a state, in a very liberal state. California passed SB 100 last year, which often gets talked about as a 100% renewable pledge or goal. It's not. It's a clean energy goal. They're going to 60% renewables by 2035 or 2030, but beyond that, it's a 100% goal that's clean. Even California, one of the most liberal states there is, has recognized that there is room for other zero-emitting technologies, and not only is there room, it's the only way to get to where we need to go.
Yeah. Stephen or Danny, anything to add?
I would just say that the Trump administration championed the Save Our Seas Act, and nobody's talking about it. So that just kind of goes back to the overarching theme of, as Republicans and conservatives, we need to champion our wins and show that we do care about the environment, and we are acting on it.
Right. Yeah, and there was the land water conservation fund authorization that was just unanimously almost passed in the House, and the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is another really good example of a conservation legislation proposed by a conservative that's getting a lot of attention, and it's about conservation. So in conservation, energy, and climate, there's a lot of action. We just don't hear about it, and as conservatives, we actually actively need to seek it out. We need to look at where these legislation and pieces of legislation are going and share it out to every person that we know, because it just shows that we do care, and there's examples of it. Cole?
I just want to kind of build on that from the messaging perspective. The policies are there. The ideas are there. We haven't owned the narrative in the past because, frankly, as Danny said, we haven't attacked the narrative. We've let the Democrats have it. And as long as we're held to the Democrats' narrative, we're always going to lose a narrative that we don't own. However, now, as you've seen the left take a very far extremist, large government view on the issue that almost everybody recognizes will stifle the economy, we have an opening. We have policies, we have ideas, we have the ability to put forth pragmatic, smart, economically sound, fiscally sound solutions, and if we do that, we could not only control the narrative, we can actually fix the issue and bring back some of those voters who have left the party because they're worried about these issues.
I'll actually jump in really quickly. I'm going to echo what Benji was saying about the need to seek out conservative environmental policies that have been successful, because when you're engaging with someone in conversation and you're saying, yes, conservatives do care about the environment, they're always going to ask you why or how, or like, do you have an example? And if you don't have something to point to that's solid, you're going to lose they're not going to hear you. So it's important that if you're trying to advocate for conservative environmental reforms, you have something solid that you can point back to.
Yeah, there's a lot of middle-of-the-road voters or people who just don't know where they stand politically, whether it be young people or old people, who, if they knew where we stood on these issues, it could be a big game changer in terms of where they stand politically, especially with young people who have this potentially as their number one issue and could, put them one way or the other on the political spectrum. So that makes it even more important for us to really champion this and actually show examples, because they won't listen if we don't have it. And the Democrats have examples ready off the bat. And so that leads to a really good question, and kind of going from policies that we can talk about quickly, who in the conservative movement do you guys look to as kind of leaders on this issue, and who are people that the audience should be looking to for kind of as icons in the conservative movement currently on this issue? Danny?
Sure. So I look to ClearPath pretty often, but I also look to CRESS, which is Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I'm a big fan of them. If you're looking for anything energy related, I would definitely recommend.
Any politicians?
Yeah, I like Stefanik. There's a couple. I tend to be more oriented towards the organizations because I think there's more voices that way.
Yeah. Stephen?
Yeah, I'd actually look towards my home state a little bit, because I think that Senator Steve Daines has been doing a pretty good job at this, and I think it's really important, because you definitely see like a conservative voice, but you won't hear it anywhere in the media or anywhere in the stream. I just want to push back just a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like controlling this narrative. Like, the left is trying to take your straws out of your like drinks, and they think that's how we're going to solve these environmental problems. Like, it's such a small thing, and they're just trying to like do the worst thing possible. Like, I know what we're going to do. They just got in the huddle and they're like, we're going to take their straws. We're going to make them feel the burn. We're going to take their straws. And it's totally ridiculous. But coming back to where we're at, I think a lot of things that you see from Western type of legislators tend to be generally okay. No one's going to be 100% on either or. But I do think, and I would point towards Steve Daines as a good example.
I'm going to go a little of a surprising route. I've referenced 45Q. The person who really made that happen in Congress is Representative McKinley from West Virginia. You don't normally think of someone from West Virginia as probably the person who had the largest impact on the environment in a positive manner that we've seen in the last 4, 6, 8 years.
Yeah.
Because what he did was say, hey, not only do I want to make the environment cleaner, not only is it an issue and I want to solve it, but by pursuing this policy, I can ensure my constituents have a role, because it's a very big coal state, and a lot of his constituents either are in the mines or obviously benefit from selling coal around the country and around the world. He said, look, I recognize that this is a problem. I recognize that climate change in the environment is a problem, and this is the path forward for the people in my district to both make an impact positively on the environment and keep their economic prosperity and grow it over the long term. You don't expect that from a Republican from West Virginia, but he had a greater impact than just about any other member of Congress in the past 5 years on this issue.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there's a lot of kind of diamonds in the rough, per se, on the environment within the conservative movement, people that you wouldn't expect. And from states you definitely wouldn't expect. I mean, we heard Montana and West Virginia. I mean, most environmentalists look down on those states in terms of, especially in terms of politicians. So the final question before we open it up for any audience questions, because I think we're running out of time here, is what do you think the easiest way for conservatives to engage on the environment is and tangibly make a difference and try to change this dialogue? And how can they do a better job of reaching out to their legislators or other activists about it? So basically, how can they make a difference on this issue? Danny?
So I'm going to answer the last part first, which is how can they make a difference with their legislators? Shameless plug, get involved with ACC. But as far as like helping the environmental movement, it's really just as easy as talking about it. You need to let people know that conservatives do have their own ideas and their own solutions, and you need to be a vocal advocate for them.
Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's big, and I would actually plug, especially if you're a college student, there's a wonderful organization called ACC Campus that is storming campuses nationwide and is 100% the go-to solution for students who care about the environment, are also conservative. And I think we just need more people on these front lines, like Danny said, really, proclaiming the good word, so to speak, so that, this conversation can start to happen a little bit. I was talking to, one of my lefty friends, like he's crazy left, like past Kamala Harris, like right next to Bernie left. And I talk to him about the environment all the time. And he's like, Republicans don't care about climate change. Conservatives don't care about climate change. And it really, after talking with him left and right, it ended up he was actually closer to where I was, because I started talking about the Green New Deal. I'm like, okay, well, is $93 trillion a feasible budget? Yes or no? And then we kind of had the conversation after some back and forth and some beers. We kind of came to a place of general consensus. And I think that's really powerful, because at first you were talking to this guy who's way to the left, absolutely hates everything I stand for other than my drinking habits, and has no idea that I even cared about the environment in the first place. And after a conversation, we came to a place of mutual understanding. And I know that's pretty anecdotal, but I think it's pretty powerful that conversation really does change people's narratives, change people's perceptions. And when we all have these conversations, we're going to be a stronger force because we do.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I think framing the issue is always important. As Stephen said, there are a lot of policies out there right now that are large government, expensive policies. I think saying, yes, congressional Republicans across the country are recognizing that environmental issues are very important, and they do have solutions. And you could talk about the solutions and say, hey, look, we believe in innovation. We want to drive costs down, not up. There's a great equity argument in there as you talk about people who are not economically well off. They can't afford some of these policies that Democrats are pushing right now. The reality is we have the ability to frame the argument that we can fix these issues in a smart, economically sound way that makes everybody better off. And I think politicians are realizing that. Politicians are hearing from swing voters most definitely that this is a huge issue. And I think the more that we can create a groundswell of people consistently in conservative politics who say, yeah, we have our 1 to 3 issues in the Republican Party or in the conservative movement that are always at the top, but right there too is environmental issues. The more that they realize that it's not just swing voters who are going to make decisions based off of this, the more it's safe for them to say, hey, we got to act on this, and we can act in a smart manner.
Steven?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say just one more thing too, because I think, and I want to say this just because it happens to me. When I think like we need to get a bunch of people involved, we need to start taking action, like there needs to be at least 500 people at our next ACC meeting, right? That doesn't necessarily need to be the step. I don't know if you all have seen this movie. It's pretty wonderful. It's called 300. And 300 of these Spartans were able to fend off an entire army. Well, what we can do here with a small, well-trained activist is really push the needle in a very positive way. It doesn't take a lot of people to take over a hashtag on Twitter. It doesn't take a lot of people to do activism on campus. And so a small group of bandits, every time in history, you've always seen a small group of people that are rising against the greater tide. I mean, that's all of us in this room right now. We can go forth and fight the good fight, talk about environmentalism, and I think it's a really powerful thing we can do.
So I haven't seen that movie, but just to add on that, I would say stop playing defense when you could be leading. This is a topic that we can be leading on, and we should be.
And I would just add one last point here. House members especially, they don't get a ton of calls to their office, right? If 5 to 10 constituents in their district come to them and say it's an issue, to them that sounds like a huge issue. And it should be a huge issue, but you don't need huge numbers to convince members that it's a huge issue.
Yeah, I think I want to point back also to one thing, Stephen, you said about how powerful it was with your friend. It's amazing how on this issue alone, you can find so much common ground with somebody who's independent or liberal. And even though you guys might disagree on the solution, right? I mean, maybe they're not full Green New Deal, but they probably disagree with you on the type of solution. You can agree that it's a problem, that you want to have a good dialogue about it. That's something that you can't do with a lot of other issues. And so it really is kind of a powerful topic to talk about when you have the opportunity to with somebody who's different and across the aisle. And then even a conversation like that probably changed his or her mind on whether or not they think conservatives care about the environment. And that, that one mind goes to another one, and it really is a snowball effect. And that goes back also lastly to Cole's point, which is that legislators want to hear from 5 or 10 people, and if they heard, I've had legislators tell me that if they had 5 or 10 of their conservative constituents reach out on a bill that had to do with the environment, it would have potentially swayed their vote. I mean, they just want to hear from people on it. And when they don't hear from any conservatives at all on environmental legislation, they're not going to prioritize it. So it is up to us as constituents of Republican either senators or Congress or House members to actually reach out and make a difference in that way. But with that, I will open it up for any questions that you guys might have in the audience. Yes.
I have a couple of questions. I don't know how you guys want to take them, but my first one is for Cole. On the policy side of things, I wonder if it would be easy to sort of streamline like a set of standards for the alternative energy, because I know that, like I live in Michigan, and you can go from county to county, and you will have completely, totally different and often conflicting standards on how you can have alternative energy, what kind of alternative energy you can have, and I mean even some like ordinances based on how it looks. You don't get to have a windmill in your yard because it looks bad to your neighbors. I think that's kind of absurd. I do have other questions, but if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real set answer to that. The best I can say is there are a ton of regulatory issues that need to be figured out. Siting is one of the huge issues in this process, and I think as we talk about overall global or even American decarbonization, one of the issues with siting that's so difficult is we really need to capture carbon, whether it's on existing plants or just direct air capture. We need to build CO2 pipelines in order to transport that carbon to some place you can use it. And so when it comes to regulatory structures, I don't think we can do something that's technology neutral, but each technology needs to have a hard look at what really needs to be regulated and what doesn't. Because right now, it's almost more expensive to get a new nuclear plant, an advanced nuclear plant, through the NRC process than it is to actually develop the concept of a plant. And that's an issue.
It's expensive.
If anyone else doesn't have one, I got one more.
We'll come back to you. Just one. Yeah, Alex.
What do you think is more important, trying to get liberals to believe that conservatives like have solutions for climate issues, or convincing conservatives who don't really care that much about the environment, particularly care about the environment?
I like that one. Cool. So I actually call it the tabling principle. And you have to get a team before you can do activism, right? So I think it's both, but the first step is certainly rallying a base, creating like-minded people around you that can then perform activism and persuade the larger masses. But it definitely starts with finding people that, agree with you. It's like, hey, you conservative? Cool. Do you care about the environment? Awesome. Let's hang out. You and I are bros. We're bros now. That's great. And now we can go out there and start persuading the masses, and two heads are greater than one. And so it's that same principle. It's the tabling principle. You can find like-minded activists that agree with you, and then together in numbers, you're going to be more persuasive and more powerful as a collective, cohesive unit.
Yeah, and without kind of getting conservatives together who care about the environment, you're not going to be able to convince people who are on the other side that you do care. So I think you do have to do that first step, but without the first step, you can't have the second step, but they do go together. It's just a matter of getting people together. And I think at this point, we have a lot of people and organizations and opportunities that we can point to already to left of center people to show them that we do care, but that doesn't mean that we can't stop growing our base, because that's vitally important.
And I'll not to take it back to politics every time, but the reality is in the Senate to pass any large comprehensive environmental or energy policy or climate change policy, you need 60 votes. I don't see us having 60 votes on either side anytime soon. So just from a political perspective, you need both. And for Republicans now, I am very worried that this issue could become our next healthcare, where we just deny solutions on the left until eventually they have numbers to cram a not so great policy down our throats. And then we're stuck with a bad policy that not only is bad, economically or for the overall system, it doesn't actually fix all the issues it set out to fix, but we get beat up with it in elections constantly. I mean, we're still reeling from the healthcare debate because we didn't have a real solution to put forth. We can't let the same thing happen when it comes to climate change.
Yeah.
Social/cultural side of things, I think one of the problems that affects everyone to some extent, and I think most people feel very guilty about, is that people are neglecting the environment around you. If you've ever driven down any interstate anywhere, there's trash everywhere. I mean, I've never once considered just throwing trash out of my window as I'm merging onto the highway.
Sure. So I think that part of the problem is that sometimes conservatives kind of have like an own the libs mentality. So if liberals are saying don't litter, conservatives want to do it just to stick it to them. I know that's so childish, but it's true. You see it all the time. Exactly. So we have to get rid of that mentality that just because they're for this means we have to be against it. And I think that if you have reasonable one-on-one conversations with people where you're talking to them on an issue where you have some common ground, like Benji was saying, that's a really good step towards changing the overall culture. And I think that this is an issue that, like Benji was saying, the left and right can come together and say this is a problem. It's just a matter of getting there and getting them to agree.
Yeah, and as an organization, we do a national cleanup day every year where we're working on that, and we focus on natural areas instead of just like urban areas, because natural areas are the most affected, like ocean shores and forests and everything are really affected by that type of thing. So that's something that we're doing, but it does come back to individual responsibility, which you mentioned, and that's something that conservatives really do deeply care about. And so bringing it back to that is a really easy way to help engage conservatives on this issue and make them realize that doing something that small, like not throwing a banana peel out your window or a plastic bag even is a good thing. Like not doing that is a really good thing, and it does matter, and it adds up. It's kind of like voting. Like you think the argument's, oh, your one vote doesn't matter. Oh, if I throw this out the window, it's just me. It's just one bag, whatever. No, it's not, because there are other people thinking like you, and the more people that don't think like you, the more that problem gets solved. So.
I just wanted to follow up by saying that it's not just the littering problem. I mean,
Right.
obviously littering has always been a problem, is probably always going to be a problem, but it's the mentality, the individual responsibility. When we wrap that up into caring about our environment on an individual basis, then everyone can start making their little changes on what kind of pollutions they're putting out or whatever. And that's how it interprets over. It's the cultural shift that needs to happen.
Right.
And I think a lot of people just don't consider the personal responsibility aspect of it. So that's actually a great talking point to use when you're trying to tell people why it's important to, think about the environment and think about what you can do.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Which environmental issue do you think has received the least amount of attention, and do you think that conservatives have the best message for resolving?
I would answer that question, and I am a one-trick pony in some ways. I work on clean energy. I work on all the ways clean energy can be beneficial. So not going all the way to climate change, but just clean energy innovation itself hasn't gotten a ton of press. When we're talking about broad economy-wide policies, we talk about a carbon tax or cap and trade, and we don't support those ourselves at ClearPath, but what's often missing from that is the innovation piece. We can't solve a global issue without innovation that provides technologies that all countries can use. So I think that aspect of the climate change debate, or of the health debate, or of the national security debate, all of that plays into that issue, and it's not talked about enough, and it's a place where we can really own, and we have started to own that, as I mentioned earlier. Like, we are investing more in clean R&D than any other administration previously. It's there and we can own it, and it's not talked about enough.
So I would agree with his answer, but for different reasons. I would say that renewable or clean energy is definitely something that conservatives overlook too often. And I think a lot of it is because when you hear something like green energy, a lot of conservatives immediately think of subsidies, and that's something that they're traditionally against. But if you look at it from the perspective of competition and innovation, it's really a conservative topic that we can champion and lead on, especially if subsidies is your hang up, then just get rid of subsidies for all energies, including oil and gas, because they also receive them.
Yeah, I actually differ. I think conservation is something that conservatives are the best at, that we have the best answer to right now. I think conservatives have to create a really good climate answer. I think that's really important. But in terms of your question and the aspect of what are we best at, conservation is what we're best at, and that's something that we've championed for literally 100+ years. It's just that we haven't recently. And so in terms of our talking points, but in policy we have. I mean, I was talking about some of those policies earlier. So I'd say conservation, and that's something that we should talk about more because it's in our name. I mean, conservatives care about conservation. It derives from the same meaning. It's caring about the land. It's having personal responsibility, like we touched on. And so I think that's, in my opinion, the thing that we don't talk about the most, that we have the best answer on. Other questions? Sure, one more.
Yeah, I wasn't here earlier, so I might have missed this, but for ClearPath representative and also for Danny, when you're talking about investing in clean energy, you're saying a lot of money went to R&D. Wouldn't that be a subsidy? If not, what is the solution for making sure that they're compatible or even competitive in a marketplace where at least oil and gas have a huge market share already? It's very difficult.
Yeah, so just through the intergovernmental process, appropriations is just the government's budget and where they put it. So that's where a lot of the money has come from, is just the regular government budget. On the incentive side, I actually differ from Danny a little bit. I think we do need incentives. The problem that we've seen with solar and wind is actually how they're structured, right? So we keep extending tax credits and incentives to these technologies that have already seen drastic price reductions to the point where now in some of the western states, wind is so cheap, and then you add on a subsidy, they're actually bidding into a market below zero. So they're paying a utility to take their power. That's an issue. That's where incentives go bad, right? So what you need is a system where the incentive scales down as you build more, as you increase market share, because incentives are important to deploying the first-of-a-kind technologies. The first advanced nuclear reactor we're going to build is going to be expensive. Carbon capture plants right now are expensive, but they have glide paths to where the 10th project is going to be much less expensive. So you might need incentives to get them off the ground, but you don't want them to be so large and last so long that it distorts a market.
I think conservatives traditionally haven't been against research and development. It's kind of like, investors and entrepreneurs, that's something that conservatives embrace, right? It's putting money into something early on, helping it grow. That's a conservative ideology and something that every Republican president has supported and conservatives support. So I think when it comes to R&D, that's something that, obviously to allow something to compete, it has to get off the ground. So I would definitely agree with Cole on that.
Yeah, and I would agree with what Benji said. I think more of what I was speaking towards is when we subsidize something for so long, the innovation stops happening because there's no incentive to innovate.
Yeah, it's subsidies that don't need to be there at all.
Right.
All right, well, with that, I will close. I think we're past time, but really appreciate everyone coming on such a short notice and with limited visibility in terms of the CPAC agenda. But I think that this issue, and as we've proven up here, is something that conservatives can take back, that we can win with, and that we have to win with to move the movement forward and the environmental movement forward. So thank you very much.